All right, well, thank you so much for having me. Let's say prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please, Lord, help me to say something that is useful to these men who are here because they care about you and your church and the Holy Catholic faith. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Boudreaux's friend Thibodeau came to see him, and he noticed that Boudreaux had a dog. And he says, "What you got there, my friend?" He says, "Well, that's my new dog, and he is the smartest dog in the whole world." He says, "Oh, really? Well, you'll have to prove that." He says, "Come on, get your gun." So they went out, and he said, "Watch this." And the dog barks one time, and a quail comes out. Walk a little bit further, the dog barks 2 times, and 2 quail come out. A little bit further, 3 times, 3 quail. Thibodeau says, "I got to have that dog." "Well, he's not for sale. I'll give you $500. "He's not for sale. I'll give you $1,000. "He's not for sale. I'll give you $1,500. Sold. Thibodeau takes his dog. 2 weeks later, Boudreaux goes to visit him. He says, "My friend, Tib, how you doing?" "Oh, it's terrible." "Well, how's the dog?" "I had to shoot that dog." "You shot a dog that you paid $1,500 for?" "He went crazy." "Tell me about it." He says, "Well, I took him out the next day. It's just like you said. Barked 3 times, 3 quail. 4 times, 4 quail. 5 times, 5 quail. Then he's gone for about 20 minutes. He comes back, he's got a stick in his mouth, and he's shaking his head, and he's all going all over the place. And I said, give me that stick, give me that stick." He wouldn't let go. He's going, I thought he had rabies, I thought he went crazy. The only thing I could do was shoot him. Boudreaux says, "Tire, you couillon. He was trying to tell you, there's more quail than you can shake a stick at." Well, the reason I started with the Boudreaux and Thibodeau joke is not so much for the humor or the particular point that it makes, but rather playing off of the last speakers that you had. The Paynes, Mr. and the son, father and son, Payne. And he mentioned a name, I don't know if many of you caught it, but it's a name really important in history. You might remember he said something about Clovis. Clovis was the first king of the Franks. And he was married to someone who what are the wives of Boudreaux and Thibodeau?
Clotilde.
Marie and Clotilde. Sometimes you see one's married to one, one's married to the other. But Clotilde is actually the wife of Clovis. Now we know Clovis in history, but that's been rendered following a Latin treatment to Louis. So the famous Louises of France and Louisiana are taking up that name. But Clovis was not originally a Catholic, but Clotilde was, and she pressured Clovis to accept baptism. And this is an extremely important event in our history as a people, because he accepted the Catholic faith. And this is in the 500s, and he's called for that reason France. He's called the father of France. The French people to this day call him the father of France. And it's very significant because he was Catholic when many of the eastern countries of Europe were infected with Arian Christianity. Arian, it was a heresy that denied the divinity of Christ. But Clovis accepted Catholic Christianity. And I'll talk more about this event and why it's important, but I wanted to just plant that little seed having to do with Boudreaux and Thibodeau, his wife Clotilde. And it reminds me of the billboard that you see around town. I don't particularly care for the billboard, but I admire the young lady that's featured on the billboard. You've probably seen this woman, her name is Malala, and she's a Pakistani Muslim. And the Taliban shot her, I think they shot her in the face. She really suffered a great deal because she wanted an education. She spoke up for that and they punished her severely. And that's a horrible thing to do, but the upshot of the billboard is girls should learn history and make it. And that's lovable enough. But I would really like to put up a billboard around town with a picture of the Blessed Virgin Mary that says, girls should learn that the greatest woman in the history of the world was a wife, mother, and homemaker. The reason I don't particularly care for the other billboard is the upshot of it is get out of the home and go do something historical. If we want to be a part of God's plan, it's really, God, what do you want me to do with my life? I promise you that the Blessed Virgin throughout her life, she sinless and graced above every other human person. Jesus is a divine person with a human nature. He's not a human person. If you hear somebody say that, they're either misspeaking or they don't know any better. But Jesus is a divine person who possesses a human nature and a divine nature. They're united in the person of the Word. But Mary is a human person. So she's the greatest person in the history of the world by far. The fathers of the church, the Catholic Church, teaches that Mary is greater than all the angels and the saints. And I promise you, she didn't go through life saying, well, how can I make a name for myself? In fact, if we think of the Annunciation and the angel telling her, you're going to be the mother of the Messiah. But he told her something else. Know that Elizabeth, your kinswoman, is with child. She's in her 6th month. I promise you that she did not think from that moment on, oh boy, am I special. I can't believe what the angel told to me. What am I going to do? What does the gospel say? She proceeded in haste to the hill country. I promise you, she's only thinking in that moment of her cousin. And she wants to go and help her aged cousin, Elizabeth, knowing, number one, that she's going to have a hard time at her age, but also knowing she's so happy that Elizabeth, who was shamefully barren, according to the culture, is going to have a child. And so Mary's not even thinking about herself. And I say that, mentioning Clotilde, mentioning the greatness of Mary, and how the most famous woman in the world never planned to be famous. In fact, it is precisely in that in which lies her greatness. It's that makes her so pleasing to God, who then showers upon her the glory, precisely because she deflects everything to him, and he says, that's what I love about you. Graced her that way, yes, but she cooperated. And I say that as a prelude to the topic that some of you may have seen the outline of it. Because if we're going to be a part of God's plan, we can't go into it thinking, we want to do this because we want to do it. What we want to do is be open to God's plan and His leadership. And I think that's evident in history, and it's evident in history as it pertains to us. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about. Now, in order to appreciate the good things that we all share here, I remember as a young person seeing planes leaving hostage situations in non-Western countries. I'll talk more about exactly what does that mean. And landing in Germany and getting off the plane and kissing the ground. And I'm thinking, why are you kissing the ground in Germany? You're not in America yet. Oh, but they had a taste in captivity of what it was like to be in a non-Christian country or a non-Western country. And when they got to Germany, knowing that they're now entering into the West with its particular civilization and its particular liberties, they were very happy to now be in the control of a civilization that had developed. And I want to talk about where did that civilization come from. And we want to start with, I'm going to go through this briefly, the coming of Jesus, but it really begins with Adam and Eve. You know, Jesus went to the cross not because he had to, and not because we wouldn't have to. He did not have to. He went to the cross to inspire us to go to our crosses. And so salvation that he brings is not something that he throws on us from the outside, but he's determined to change us from the inside. And that's the story of Adam and Eve and their fall and their plunge into darkness and their children into darkness. And in order to appreciate what we have today, we need to look at what life was like before God's involvement in mankind, before the coming of the Son of God. And it can be depicted this way. In general, the ancient world, the pagan world, was a place of cynicism and darkness and vice and promiscuity, the mistreatment of women, men left to their unbridled passions. And now throughout the world, sometimes this was very, very dark and horrible, and sometimes it wasn't quite so bad, but no matter where you go, there were certain things that were universal in the ancient world. First, there was polygamy. No civilization in the history of the ancient world ever successfully enforced the idea that one woman is entitled to one man's entitled to one woman. The selfishness of men, even in Judaism, did not enforce the prohibition against polygamy. Moses allowed it. We all know why, because men were killing their wives. So he says better, as St. Thomas said, better to tolerate a lesser evil than to try to prohibit a greater evil. You kind of do the best you can. Polygamy and just general second-class, third-class, fourth-class citizenship for women throughout the ancient world. Slavery. At the time of Jesus, half the world was living in slavery. Slaves were not deterred by threats of death. For the most part, trying to think of the bumper sticker that says, life is terrible, then you die. I don't want to say the word that is said on the bumper stickers, but the idea that life for a slave in the ancient world was not pleasant at all. And to threaten to kill him, he'd say, go ahead, get it over with. No, they would torture. That's what crucifixion was all about, and they had other means of torture. To intimidate slaves, they tortured them, and to make an example of everyone else. Rulers were absolute and ruled by whim. If you looked at it the wrong way, he could put you to death. Any of the rulers of the ancient world could put you to death for no reason, for any reason. And generally they ruled by fear. And like I said, some of the places were not quite so bad, some of the places were really bad. If we kind of look from east to west, India was very confused, hardly had a history, many gods, many of them dark. China, a little bit better, a little bit nobler, more of an ancestral reverence, but still very confused. Japan, much the same way. I'm going to skip over Europe for a moment because we're going to spend more time on that. The Americas in the ancient world were still living in the Stone Age in the north. Nomadic, just like they were in Arabia. Nomadic, didn't have couldn't until you settle down in a city. You can't have civilization until you can record your deeper thoughts. And so they're wandering wherever the food takes them. Some of the tribes very fierce and warlike, some of them less so. Central America had descended into tremendous darkness, devil worship, human sacrifice. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's one of the dark spots along with some of the other countries. I said some are a little better, some are really terrible. This was one of the worst. Cortez, when he landed, was sickened and shocked and put a stop to the human sacrifice. They would sacrifice on those pyramids, the ziggurats. Notice that they're different from the pyramids of Egypt. Egypt, a little bit loftier vision of things, a little bit more of an idea of the afterlife. In Central America, both the Mayans and the Aztecs had these big temples, but at the top, they would conduct, almost all of them, human sacrifice, sometimes 20,000 souls a day. They would stretch out the hapless victim on a stone, and the priests would plunge a very sharp knife into their area right here, reach their hand in, and rip out their beating heart and hold it up to their devil god. I'm generalizing a great deal. You can read about it for yourself and get much more detail exactly who these gods were and why they did what they did. And they're not all of them completely debased. They had a rhyme to their reason, but most of the people of the ancient worlds who engaged in some kind of sacrifice, and many did, this was just super abundant of their sacrifices, the human sacrifice. But many of the people in the ancient worlds had some degree of human sacrifice, not to this scale. But everybody had their worship in order to placate or strengthen or influence or get favors from their gods. And most of them, it revolved around the sun. Because in Central America, when the sun was getting nearer and nearer the solstice, when the nights were getting longer and longer and the days were getting shorter and shorter, they would say, we need blood. They need blood. They need life. So they come back. So they won't just plunge in the darkness and we all die because we have no crops or anything to eat. So they would give these feverish sacrifices, and lo and behold, the sun would turn around. They say, yay, we're good for another year. Now, so the ancient world was a terrible place. Now in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, the east side of the Mediterranean, God is doing something extraordinary. He's been working with Abraham and teaching him a way to overcome the darkness that mankind had plunged into that I just described. The first thing he says is there's one God, not hundreds, not thousands. There's one God. And he successfully inculcates this idea into Abraham's head. And he takes him on the journey, and we all know that story. Even when he's about to sacrifice Isaac, his shock, oh, I can't believe he even thought about doing it. Well, he knew that this happens. And I guess he thought his God was requiring this of him. We know the story, the angel stopped it. But he's working with Abraham, and then we know the story of getting sold into slavery into Egypt by his descendants, and we know the delivery of Moses out of Egypt. All this while, the Jews are learning by God's design a special character, primarily based on containing their bad behavior and teaching them some theological truths about the nature of God so that they can become reacquainted. And my main point in all this is to say that this process, you'd think that Jesus, after 2,000 years in the world of 7 billion people, there's 2 billion Christians, 1.2 billion Catholics, 300 million Protestants, 300 million Orthodox, roughly. Why isn't there 7 billion? Why, after 2,000 years, has the whole world not been changed since the Son of God came to the planet? It's because God is changing us from the inside out. And he's going to change our nature in order to reveal to us something that is above our nature. And the primary goal he's after is that mankind can become integrated with reality. Salvation is integration with reality. It's the way things are, not the way things hope them to be. In the ancient world's worship of the gods, they were always projecting onto God what they assumed he was. But God is saying, no, I'm not what you imagine. And I'm going to gradually, over thousands of years, correct your misunderstandings. To their credit, the people of the ancient world, first of all, were not dumb. And secondly, they were more religious than many are today. It is simply wrong to think of them as stupid and wrong of them to think of as godless. There were no atheists in the ancient world. Atheism is something that came about a couple of hundred years ago. People were too smart in the ancient world. They were confused about how many gods and the nature of gods and had all kinds of imperfections about who God is. But nobody believed there were no gods. They were too smart for that. So God is clarifying things, saying there's one God and you can't behave like this because I'm not like that. You are sinful and you got to clean up your act. So he's working with Abraham and Moses, and we know the story of the narrowing and the narrowing and the narrowing. By the time of Jesus, we have one tribe dominant. It's the tribe of Judah, from which the Messiah is going to come. But that's not the only thing he did. God is working in two other places in sequence. Before Jesus, when you read the expression in the Bible, in the fullness of time, you should think automatically Greco-Roman, Israelite, Judaic culture. Because he's working with the Jews, but he's also working with a particularly important country to us, the Greeks, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Because we have this figure, Alexander the Great, about 300 years before Jesus, but more importantly, his tutor was Aristotle. And the three great philosophers of the ancient world, of all the hundreds of philosophers, the Greeks had a handle on this, blessed by God. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates about 20% right, Plato about 50-60% right, Aristotle, says the church, about 99% right. Aristotle, a great gift to the human race. He understands natural truth And this is a very, very important part in the rehabilitation of mankind. Alexander, like an apostle, spreads not only the philosophy of the Greeks, but the language of the Greeks, because what we needed in the fullness of time is a sophisticated language in order to communicate the fine points that theology would entail to describe the nature of God when Jesus comes. It would have been impossible 500 years ago for the Son of God to appear and have any particular lasting impact in sub-Saharan Africa. The language was too simple. They just didn't have the sophistication to process what needed to be processed. So we have Alexander comes and he conquers that whole world and puts upon the Jews and everybody in that world a common language that's very sophisticated, the Greek language. But then on the heels of that come the Romans. And the Romans established something also that's very important, the Roman law. And so we have in the fullness of time, Jesus comes as a child of the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews, but he has the ability to speak to an audience that's recorded in Greek with a sophisticated language, the writers of the books that he would speak, and spread throughout a world that, though the Romans were very dark, in the sense of they practiced things that we regard as cruel today, but in the ancient world they were the most civilized power the world had ever known, at least at the time of Jesus. Some corruption came in quite a bit later. So my point is that we have a dark pagan world, and then we have Jesus comes into a particular world, and he delivers his message to these 12 men. And one of the themes I'm going to use throughout the rest of the talk is this idea of, I was thinking of a baton, I thought of a hot potato, I thought of a torch. You know, John Kennedy did the famous, a torch has been passed to a new generation. So I'll go with torch. So Jesus Christ, who knows the truth about his Father, who came to reveal it, but he reveals it to these flawed men and to St. Paul, who's very highly educated. So he reveals this truth and the power of the sacraments. He establishes a religious hierarchy, names Peter the first pope, and he passes the torch to them. And we know he ascends into heaven, and now we see recorded in the Acts of the Apostles the church now, after Pentecost, finding her legs. And they spread all over the world and begin transforming the world very slowly. Many go to the east, and some go to the west. Now, the first 300-something years of this project, very difficult, and yet the church is growing. Very reliable studies show that the church, in various persecutions, was growing at 40% a decade, 4% a year. Like I said, which church in here posts those kinds of numbers? 40% a decade. In very difficult situation, they were either second-class citizens or harassed or positively hunted down and killed, tortured and killed. Even in the midst of this persecutions, they grew and grew. And then we have Constantine, of course, which Protestants regard as the beginning of the Catholic Church. Not so. It was there from the very beginning, and historically can be proven that. But we have Constantine comes, and then the empire continues to get big but corrupted, and they split the empire. And this is the next point that I want to make, that primarily in the East, where this torch has been passed, and the apostles are establishing churches throughout this world, and yet because of the Roman Empire became too big to handle, they split it, and we have the Christians of the East beginning to develop differently than the Christians of the West. But our story, and hopefully you're kind of seeing why I'm going through this process, but our story is connected to the Christians of the West. I mentioned Clovis. This is now the year 500 and something. And he is a warlord, as all the old leaders were. And he accepts baptism. And the church assigns this title to him in history, becoming the first king of France and making the people of France the eldest daughter of the church. And so the Pope in Rome, eventually 500, 600, 700 years later, begins to see that he can't depend on the emperor in the East to help him, to protect him anymore. And so he makes this monumental decision to turn his attention to the West. And especially since there where the Catholics are strongest and these strong leaders. Clovis, a couple of generations later, has a not relative, but a very important guy in history that was associated with his regime, Charles Martel. In history, he's called the Hammer. Martel means hammer. And I'll tell in a minute why he's an important figure. And it has to do with the theme, because we have the baton, the torch passing from Jesus to the apostles, primarily in the East, and the people of the East end up passing a large part of the importance and the power of this development of the Catholic project. The baton is passed to the barbarians, pagans of Europe. Now, they're not as dark as many of these other places. They were primarily tree nature worshipers. Fierce, could be fierce in battle, needed the Roman training and Roman backbone, which they got. And this key figure in France, which really France at the time is a big part of Germany as well, and we're going to see that play out in just a little bit. But we see the Pope's attention turn to the Catholics of the West. And this is a very significant moment in history, because the East would go on for a long, long time and get hammered by the Muslims. We're going to talk about them in a little bit. And many of the places in the East fell. Many of the Eastern Christians had fallen to various heresies that once Catholicism became legalized, you'd think that would be wonderful, and it turned out to be not so wonderful, because immediately they were racked with some very, very significant heresies. The biggest one of all was the Arian heresy that denied that Jesus was God. This is going to be hard to believe, but about 2/3 of the Catholic bishops succumbed and fell to the Arian heresy. Imagine a world today that claimed that there was a time when the sun was not, which was their formula for the Arian heresy. So in the East, they were grappling with a lot of these heresies, and it made them very vulnerable to the advance of Islam. Muhammad was born in 560 something, and within 100 years of his birth, his armies were on the march. Out of Arabia, all of North Africa was Catholic. All of the Holy Land was Catholic. Many of the first places, though, had fallen to some of these heresies, and it made them weak to stand up against Muhammad and his followers. to stand up against his followers. It was his followers who went on the rampage. And the Christians who were half heretics said, you know what? What's the difference? You know, he's teaching something about Jesus. We believe something about Jesus. We don't want to go to our death. We'll accept to submit. That's what Islam means, to Islam. So he goes all across North Africa, and he crosses the Strait of Gibraltar. Within 10 years, he overruns all of the Iberian Peninsula, except for one place up in the north, where another important figure, I talked about Clovis, I talked about Charles Martel, very important figure for our history, is a fellow by the name of Pelayo. And he did something that sometimes we have to do. We think of people advancing, but sometimes it's retreating and secluding that you have to do in order to preserve something. And that's what he had to do. He and 500 people went up into the rough hill country. Remember when the Muslims went into Afghanistan, into the hills, and the Soviet Union couldn't get them out, and they gave up? Well, the hill country, if you want to look at a map of it, is horrible, horribly difficult to assault hill country in the north of Spain. And that's where Pelayo went to hide out with the Catholics he could gather. And they tried to root him out and tried again, and they would go up in the hills and rain arrows down on them coming up the valleys. 20,000 men against 500, tried it again and again and gave up. They said, what's 500 people going to do, is what they said. And so they went back. Now, at the same time, they're pushing into about a third of France. So they overrun Spain, they retreat, they push into France, and that's where they're stopped by Charles Martel the Hammer. Historians universally agree that had Martel not stopped the Muslims, all of France would have been lost. Everything that would have counted in Europe, we'd be speaking Arabic today. This was not the only assault, this was the first assault. There were others to come. But my point that I'm making right now is that the West, Catholic Europe, holds a unique place in the history of the world. And part of it was because they had to fight for their faith. It became a pressure cooker. They were assaulted from the south and the west. They were assaulted from the east. The Muslims made it 100 years later to the gates of Vienna. And then about 100 years later, they tried from the south at the Battle of Lepanto. All three of them, though outnumbered, the Christians, thanks be to God, prevailed and won the day and preserved Catholic Europe. But this pressurizing ended up purifying and focusing them on what really mattered. Now, the reason I'm going into that detail about not just Christendom, but Western Europe, and particularly France, England, and Spain, because those three countries are the ones that settled America. We think of what language are we speaking today? English. The English played no small part in the settlement of America. But before the English came were the Spanish. And, you know, the famous limerick, let me back up just a moment. Pelayo in the north of Spain, he was able to hold on to and preserve the Catholic faith in Spain. And they spent 770 years kicking the Muslims out of Spain. Before you can kick somebody out, you've got to preserve what you have. And that's exactly what happened. And as they would get some success, more people would join them, and it took 770 years. And one of the points that I'm trying to stress with this group is that this is a battle that's not necessarily going to be won by us. It may be won by our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And yet, we have got to demonstrate to them the value of the faith. This is saying love is caught, not taught. Virtue is caught, not taught. They have to see you live it. One of my favorite sayings of Jesus, he tells the parable about the man who builds his house on sand and the man who builds his house on rock. And he says the winds came and blew down the house built on sand, but the house on rock stayed. And he pulls a lesson out of that. He says, happy will you be if. It's not immediately clear to me what point you're going to make from this house analogy. Happy will you be if you put my words into practice. You cannot own a virtue without living it. When we step through death's door, we're only going to take with us the virtues that we have lived. They become a part of us, and they will be a part of us for all eternity. And so this clarity of the Catholic faith that they had in Western Europe is the civilization that we inherited. Now, in this 770-year push to kick the Muslims out of Spain, the last Muslim stronghold in the south of Spain, Granada, was finally defeated by the great Isabella and Ferdinand in the famous year of 1492. Finally, she was able to listen to Columbus, who she perceived as a pious man, and was willing then to finance, to turn her attention in an apostolic endeavor, to turn her attention so that he might make this voyage. And so the Spanish came first to basically Central America, and coming up from the south, eventually into California and New Mexico and all the Spanish possessions that you can look at on any map to see how they came from the south. The French came also to the north, to Canada, what they called New France. This was a little bit later, but they were establishing settlements in Canada, coming down the various rivers, I think the St. Lawrence River, and made their way to the Mississippi, and claimed for, where did we get our name from? Louis, one of the Louises, particularly Louis XIV, who was king of France at the time that they claimed the whole Mississippi, which was double the size of the United States. We know that it was eventually sold to Thomas Jefferson in 1802 by Napoleon. So we have the French Catholicism, we have New England area and the 13 colonies, and then we have the French coming from the north, the Spanish coming from the south. Now, so the point I'm making now is the torch goes from the east to Western Europe, and the West still hanging on to the torch. But you see heaven already planted, man, you're going to have to pass this on. Because coming around